believe in forgiving or forgetting?
She didn't even blink when she said it, just sat there, hands folded on that old cherrywood table like a smug little queen on her throne, while the rest of us held our breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. My mother had always had a flair for timing, always knew exactly when to drop a bomb so it made the biggest crater. She called the whole family together on a Saturday night, made her signature lasagna with the crispy edges that everyone used to fight over, poured 2 kinds of wine, the good kind too, not the box stuff she saves for weekdays, and set the table like she was hosting a damn Thanksgiving feast. Nobody knew why. Not even Aunt Linda, who usually has her ear glued to every family secret, had any clue what the hell this was about. Then, right when dessert was about to come out, she cleared her throat, raised her glass, and said, in that same cold, measured tone she used when I brought home a B in math in the 8th grade, "I've updated my will. Erica's been removed." And she sipped her wine like it was just another Thursday. You ever feel like your brain just stops for a second? Like it needs to buffer, like a cheap DVD stuck on a scratch scene? That was me. Sitting in a dining room filled with people who shared my blood, yet somehow never seemed to see me. And all of them, every last one, turned to look at me like they were waiting for a reaction, some dramatic breakdown, some wailing fit or thrown glass, like they'd finally pushed me hard enough to break. But I didn't give them that satisfaction. I smiled. I smiled wide and easy, like I had just been handed a slice of peach pie instead of a public humiliation, and said, "Thank you." And that's when the real fun began. But to understand how I got there, how I reached the point where I could sit in that same chair I once cried in as a teenager and smile through a moment like that, you need to understand what it was like growing up in my family. I'm Erica Lynn Sanders. 42 years old, divorced twice, no kids, made VP before 35, and I have never once, not once, been my mother's favorite. That title belongs, and has always belonged, to my brother Mark. Mark with the cleft chin and the full-ride scholarship and the wife who wears pearls to brunch. Mark, who once crashed Dad's Mustang and somehow still got a new one the next week. Mark, who got bailed out of his second DUI with one call to Mom, while I got kicked out of the house at 19 for asking if I could move back home after a breakup. Mom has always treated him like the heir to the family crown, even though we have no kingdom to inherit, just a 3-bedroom ranch house in northern Georgia and a collection of expired antiques from yard sales she insists are worth something if you find the right buyer. Growing up, I learned quickly that love in our house was conditional, but Mark's was unconditional by default. He never had to earn it. Me? I had to fight for scraps. I had to get straight A's, stay out of trouble, never cry, never complain, and still, it was never quite enough. When I got into college on a partial scholarship, Mom's first words weren't, "I'm proud of you." They were, "Why didn't you get a full ride like your brother?" When I married my first husband, she told me she didn't trust a man who wore boots with slacks. When I got promoted to senior manager at my firm, she asked, "Is that above Mark now?" like it was a competition I wasn't allowed to win. So when I got that call last Tuesday, her voice clipped informal as she said, "Family dinner. Be here Saturday. It's important." I knew something was coming. I didn't know what exactly, but I knew. And still I showed up. Drove 4 hours from Atlanta, even brought a bottle of wine she likes, trying to be the dutiful daughter. And there I was, sitting across from her at that table, next to my brother, who had the same smug smirk he wore when he beat me at Monopoly by stealing from the bank when we were kids. Of course he knew. He always knows. They keep each other's secrets. But here's what they didn't know. They didn't know that last year, while Mark was busy showing off his new waterfront office space, I was quietly studying the cracks in his empire. They didn't know that after I left my job, which, for the record, I didn't lose, I cashed out and walked away, I spent 6 months traveling under a different name, meeting with people who knew how to pull strings and buy companies without anyone asking too many questions. They didn't know that while they thought I was spiraling, I was actually planning. So when she said I'd been removed from the will, not just cut back, but completely erased, I knew that was my cue. The moment I'd been preparing for. Now, I won't lie, it stung. I'm not made of stone. That was my own mother telling me, in front of a table full of relatives and their side-eyed whispers, that I was no longer her daughter in any meaningful way. She looked me in the eye and said I didn't matter, that I was expendable. But what she didn't realize, what Mark didn't see coming, is that I wasn't at that table to ask for anything. I wasn't there to beg or plead or get my seat back at the family dinner table. I was there to flip the table over. And as soon as she finished her little toast, as the silence sat thick in the air like fog before a storm, I leaned into my purse, pulled out a small, white envelope, and slid it across the table to Mark. He looked at it like I'd handed him a subpoena. Glanced up at me, all confused, the way a man does when he knows something's wrong but doesn't know if it's already too late to stop it. "Go ahead," I said. "Open it." And as he pulled the card out, his hands started to tremble, just a little, but enough that I caught it. Aunt Linda leaned in. My cousin Noah tried to peek. And then Mark's face dropped. Because inside that envelope was something no one at that table expected. The title transfer to his company. The one he started 10 years ago. The one he built from the ground up. The one he thought was still his. But it wasn't anymore. Because now it was mine. And this? This was only the beginning. For a moment, maybe 3 seconds, maybe 30, I swear you could hear nothing but the sound of Mark's heartbeat pounding inside his skull, or maybe that was just the collective mental whiplash echoing off the dining room walls, as everyone leaned forward slightly. Not even realizing they'd stopped chewing or breathing, eyes flicking between his frozen expression and the plain white envelope that now lay open beside his untouched plate of garlic bread. It was a strange thing, really, how something so small, just a few typed pages inside a card I'd picked up at a gas station, could cause the man who'd coasted through life on charm, safety nets, and other people's blind loyalty to suddenly lose every ounce of that famous confidence in the span of a single breath. He didn't speak. Not right away. He couldn't. His mouth opened slightly, like he was about to form words, but nothing came out except air, which seemed to hit the back of his throat like gravel. He looked down at the paper again, his eyes scanning it as if maybe, just maybe, he'd misread something, that somehow this was all a prank, or maybe some legal misunderstanding, but deep down, I think he already knew that the worst possible version of what he was seeing was the real one. That title wasn't a threat, and it wasn't a bluff. It was legally binding, notarized, and fully enforceable. I hadn't come to ask for scraps. I'd come to end a very long game. My mother finally broke the silence, her voice low but laced with an edge sharper than broken glass, the kind of tone she used when someone scratched her hardwood floors or spilled red wine on a beige rug. "What is that, Mark?" she asked, though I have no doubt she already knew she wasn't going to like the answer, because something in her eyes had shifted, just slightly, but enough to betray that beneath her chilly exterior, there was a flicker of unease. Like she could already sense that the script she'd written wasn't the one we were now performing. Mark didn't answer her. Not immediately. He just looked up at me, his jaw tight, that familiar arrogance drained from his face, replaced by something closer to disbelief mixed with something he probably hadn't felt in years: fear. Not fear of violence or scandal or even financial ruin, but the kind of fear that sets in when you realize someone you thought was beneath you has not only caught up, but passed you, and they've done it quietly, efficiently. And with a smile that tells you they waited a long time for the moment to arrive. "It's a transfer of ownership," he finally said, voice dry, cracked, barely above a whisper. "Of my company." The last 2 words hung in the air like a dying echo, and I could almost hear the collective confusion setting in around the table, the low buzz of speculative judgment swirling in every direction. Margaret, my mother, if we're still calling her that, narrowed her eyes and leaned back slightly, the way she always did when trying to recenter control without making it obvious. "That's ridiculous." "What do you mean, ownership? That's not possible. You built that company." "Yes," I said, calmly, folding my napkin and placing it on my lap like I was preparing for a dessert course. "He built it. But over the past 18 months, I've been buying it." I let that sink in, let the weight of my words press down like a slow snowfall that only becomes dangerous when you realize it's heavy enough to collapse a roof. Piece by piece. Share by share. Through two shell corporations, an offshore trust, and a silent partner agreement signed last spring when the company was nearly underwater and Mark was too arrogant, or too desperate, to check who was bailing him out. You could practically feel the air thinning in the room, like someone had cracked a window in the middle of winter, but no one was quite willing to get up and close it. Mark shook his head slowly, eyes darting across the table as if looking for someone to step in, someone to argue on his behalf, but all he found were half-chewed desserts and awkward stares. Because what do you say when the family golden boy has just been publicly stripped of the one thing that defined him? I continued, not raising my voice, but making sure every word landed with intention. I knew something was coming. I could feel it. The silence. The sudden coldness on your calls, Mom. The way you started asking what I was doing with my life like you'd forgotten I was running million-dollar freight contracts before I could legally rent a car. And then Mark started asking me about investors, about my old contacts, about liquidation options, only he didn't know I'd already been watching. That I'd already seen the numbers. That I'd already talked to two of his former partners, the ones who walked away without lawsuits because they didn't want the truth coming out. Margaret raised a hand like she wanted to stop me, wanted to stop the bleeding, maybe, but I wasn't finished, and I wasn't about to give her the space to regain footing. Not now. Not after everything. You used my college fund to keep him out of debt when he failed the first time. You lied to me about it, told me the money disappeared in a market crash. I found the records, by the way. The wire transfers. You bailed him out again when he got caught mixing personal and business accounts in 2018. I kept quiet because I thought maybe, just maybe, it would come back around. That being the quiet daughter, the reliable one, would one day mean something. That eventually you'd see I had value too. But instead, you made your little announcement tonight, didn't you? I smiled, sharp as a knife. And that's fine. Truly. Because now I don't need your money. I don't need your name. And I sure as hell don't need your approval. You took me off paper, so I took something else off yours. Aunt Linda, who'd been silent until now, finally let out a slow whistle and muttered under her breath, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, like she'd just watched a lion eat a priest in church. Across the table, my cousin Noah choked slightly on his wine, while my other brother Evan looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear into the floorboards. And Mark, my poor, dumb brother, sat there still holding the card, like if he squeezed it hard enough, maybe it would change what was written on it. He didn't say another word. He didn't have to. The silence spoke for him. But me? I wasn't done. Not yet. Because this was only part one. The appetizer. The first wave. And the main course was coming. I leaned in, just enough for only him to hear. This isn't even the good part. There's a certain kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it swells, it climbs the walls, it seeps under doors and into people's pores, settling somewhere deep in the chest where it turns breath into cement. That was the kind of silence we sat in after I dropped that envelope on the table, the kind where no one wants to move because whatever happens next could be worse than what just happened, and everyone knows it. Mark sat like he'd just been handed a death certificate with his name printed across the top, staring down at the title transfer with disbelief clinging to his skin like sweat, trying to convince himself there had to be some kind of mistake, a clerical error, a forgery, maybe even a prank gone too far, but I knew the exact moment reality caught up to him because his eyes finally stopped moving. They just settled. Empty. It took him a full 30 seconds to remember that he had legs, another 10 to realize they could be used to stand, and when he finally did, the chair scraped back hard enough on the hardwood to make Linda flinch and knock her fork onto the floor. He didn't say anything to me, didn't even look at me, just clutched the paper like it was burning through his fingers and stormed out of the dining room, muttering something about making a call, his voice tight and cracked like something pressed too hard for too long. I knew where he was going. His lawyer, maybe. His CFO. Someone he could vent to, someone who might lie to him out of habit, someone who'd tell him what he wanted to hear, that this wasn't real, that it wasn't binding, that it could all be undone. He was wrong. My mother, meanwhile, sat across from me still holding her wine glass, her fingers so still I wondered if she even remembered she was holding it, her expression unreadable in that polished way she'd mastered over decades of carefully curated family control, the kind that keeps people from asking too many questions at holiday dinners, the kind that allowed her to keep secrets buried just long enough to rot without stinking up the room. She looked at me the way someone looks at a stranger who knows their darkest story. There was no maternal confusion, no wounded concern, not even anger, just a cold, quiet calculation, the gears in her head shifting wildly behind the mask, trying to map out the damage. "You bought your brother's company," she said finally, not accusing, not even surprised, just flat, like she was already skipping ahead to what this meant for her. "Why?" And just like that, there it was. Not how, not when, not "are you okay?" Not even an ounce of curiosity about whether I'd done it because I was desperate, or because I was ambitious, or because something broke in me that I couldn't fix. Just why. As in, why would you take something that belongs to him? Which, in her world, was the same as asking, why would you betray this family? I took my time before answering. I wanted to see if anyone else at the table would speak, if anyone, even once, would ask me the obvious question, how did you pull this off? But of course they didn't. Because they'd never imagined I was capable of something like this in the first place. "I didn't just buy it," I said, finally, my voice low but steady. "I acquired it. Quietly. Over the course of a year. Through 2 different holding companies and an investment partner whose name I guarantee neither of you know. I did my homework. I waited for the right time. I waited until he was too arrogant to vet the paperwork. Until he was desperate enough to take money from a stranger without a background check. I waited until he was vulnerable, the same way you waited until you were sure I was isolated enough to humiliate in front of this family without a scene." The room didn't breathe. My aunt's husband had stopped chewing entirely. I think he still had a piece of tiramisu on his spoon. "You tricked your own brother?" Margaret said, and the way she said it, the implication in her voice that the act itself was the betrayal, not everything that led up to it, made something twist in my gut, something hot and sharp and familiar. Because that's always been her logic, hasn't it? Mark can fail, he can lie, he can cheat, he can drain family money and call it borrowing, and it will always be forgiven. But me? If I take one step out of line, if I show 1 ounce of teeth, suddenly I'm the one who needs to be controlled. I leaned forward, elbows on the table, locking eyes with her so she couldn't look away. "I didn't trick him, Mom. He signed the papers. He agreed to the terms. I just made sure the terms were in my favor." Her face didn't flinch, but her wine glass finally hit the table with a soft clink, and that was enough for me. A crack in the armor. "You used my college fund to bail him out in 2006, I added, almost like an afterthought, though it wasn't. Told me the money was lost in a market crash. But I found the bank statements. I know you funneled it through a dormant account into his failing startup. I also know you never intended to pay it back." That was when I stopped expecting fairness from this family. The color drained from her face just a shade, and that was all the confirmation I needed. Because the truth was, I had suspected for years. But only recently had I confirmed it. The records were buried in an old tax return, flagged by an accountant I paid in cash to dig deep. One sentence on page 32 had changed everything, a wire transfer from my college fund into a private account listed under one of Mark's shell companies. My education turned into a second chance. That was when I realized the game wasn't rigged, it was handcrafted by her. "Do you think this makes you right?" she asked, voice suddenly quiet, not meek but dangerously close to brittle. "Do you think this makes us even?" "No," I said. "It makes us honest." Because the truth was, I hadn't done all of this to hurt Mark, not entirely. It had started as a defense mechanism, a safety net, a way to take back control in a life where every safety net I was promised had been secretly reserved for someone else. But the more I dug, the more I saw how deep it went, the lies, the favoritism, the manipulations masked as love, and by the time I had the power to stop it, I realized I didn't want to stop it. I wanted to flip the dynamic. I wanted to make them see what it felt like to be powerless in a room full of people who called themselves family. The door slammed down the hall. Mark was back. He returned without the envelope, without his phone, without a single trace of smugness left in him. He didn't sit. He just hovered at the threshold of the dining room like a kid who'd just been sent to the principal's office. "I want to talk," he said. I smiled again. Not a smirk. Not smug. Just calm, patient, and very, very ready. I looked up at him and said, "Then let's talk." But what I didn't say, not yet, was that talking was only step 2. Step 3? That was the part he was going to really hate. There's something haunting about the way a house changes after a confrontation. Even if no one says it out loud, the air grows heavier, every creak in the floorboard sounds sharper, and the walls themselves seem to pull inward like they're listening too closely, bearing witness to the kind of truths that families like mine spend entire lifetimes pretending don't exist. Mark stood just outside the dining room archway like he didn't quite belong anymore, his hand gripping the trim as if he needed the support to stay upright, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something I hadn't seen in him since we were kids. Not shame exactly, but something rawer, something closer to realization, as if the paper he'd held in his hands had weighed more than just ink and ownership, but also consequence, failure, and a future no longer under his control. When he finally spoke again, his voice was calmer than I expected, not gentle, but measured, the tone of a man trying to find his balance after the floor's been pulled out from under him, still searching for a ledge that isn't there. "You could have just told me," he said, the words floating out like a peace offering he knew I wouldn't accept. "You didn't have to ambush me in front of the entire family." That was cruel, Erica. And maybe it was. Maybe it would have been kinder to do it in private, to pull him aside and show him the paperwork one-on-one, allow him to fall apart behind a closed door, away from the eyes of a mother who had never allowed either of us to appear weak. But the truth is, the cruelty had started years ago, in smaller, quieter ways, and it had never been mine to begin with. I had simply returned it in a form they couldn't ignore. "You know it's cruel, Mark?" I said, not rising from my seat, not breaking eye contact. "Watching our mother rewrite history over and over again in your favor, while pretending I should be grateful for the scraps she called love. You got second chances without even asking." I got silence for asking why. He rubbed his jaw, that same jawline she always said made him look like a Kennedy, and for a moment I could see that he wasn't just angry, he was disoriented, because for the first time in his life, the world had stopped bending in his favor. And the rules had changed without his permission. "I didn't ask her to cut you out of the will," he muttered. A quiet defense meant more for his own guilt than for my forgiveness, and I believed him, or at least, I believed that he hadn't needed to ask. She had done it because she wanted to, because in her mind I had stepped too far out of line, said too much, learned too much, and a daughter who doesn't know her place is a threat to a mother who needs control more than she needs truth. "No," I replied, "you didn't ask. But you didn't stop it either. You've always been comfortable benefiting from what she takes from me." He flinched, just slightly, and I knew I'd hit the truth too hard to be ignored. What he didn't know, what no one else in that house yet knew, was that this wasn't just about business. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about something deeper, something I hadn't spoken of out loud in 3 years, not because I'd forgotten it, but because some truths have teeth, and when you finally pull them out, they don't stop biting. "I know about the affair," I said, the words so calm they didn't register at first. "Between you and Daniel." His head jerked slightly, not violently, but in that way a body does when it's been caught off guard, like he'd just been slapped without being touched. The room had gone still again, and I could feel Margaret's gaze on me like a razor, though she didn't speak. "Not yet." "Excuse me," Mark said, but I could already see the panic blooming behind his eyes, not just fear of exposure, but the deep, pulsing dread of a man who realizes he's been living inside a lie he thought was buried. 3 years ago, I continued, unblinking, Daniel came to the lake house alone. You showed up the next morning. You didn't think I saw his phone light up the night before with your name. You didn't think I'd hear your voice behind the guest house door. Margaret pushed her chair back slowly, not fast enough to be dramatic, but deliberately, like she was bracing herself for the collapse of something she'd held up with bare hands and denial. "That's enough, Erica." "No," I said, turning to her with a calm so sharp it cut through the pretense like broken glass. "It's not. You didn't remove me from the will because I was a disappointment. You did it because I knew. And instead of facing what your perfect son did, you decided to erase the only witness. Mark sat down. He didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He didn't even lift his eyes. The weight of it all sat on his shoulders now, and for once, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt clarity. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was revelation. I kept your secret, I said, my voice lower now, heavier, because I thought maybe, deep down, he loved me more than he loved control. But he didn't. And you taught him that. Margaret's hands trembled slightly on the edge of the table, her breath shallow, her eyes glassy, not with tears, but with the kind of panic a person feels when their version of reality begins to fracture, and they don't know which part to hold on to. You are not the woman I raised, she whispered. And that was the moment I stood, slow and deliberate, feeling the blood in my chest settle with finality. No, I said. I'm the woman you created. The one who finally learned how to play the game you taught us, but better. I walked past Mark, who didn't even lift his head, and past Margaret, who no longer looked like a matriarch, but like a woman who'd spent her whole life building a legacy she just realized had turned to ash in her hands. And as I reached the door, I paused just long enough to look over my shoulder, not to rub it in, not to bask in some false sense of victory, but to deliver the truth they had both earned. You took my silence and made it proof of guilt. You took my absence and called it failure. You took my name off a piece of paper and thought that would make me disappear. I smiled, not cruelly, but honestly. Now I get to be the villain in your story. And this time, I'm not cleaning up the mess. And with that, I left the room. But not the story. Because the final chapter hadn't even started yet. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a reckoning, not the tense, anticipatory silence that comes before a confrontation, nor the electric, heart-pounding stillness that precedes a lie being uncovered, but a hollow, cavernous stillness that feels like standing in the middle of a house after the windows have been blown out and the storm has passed, where everything looks familiar, but nothing is quite the same. That was the silence I stepped into the next morning when I walked back into the house, not through the front like a guest, not through the garage like a daughter, but straight through the back patio door like someone who no longer cared about pretending. The dining room table was empty now, no lasagna, no crystal glasses, no snide commentary veiled in fake smiles, just chairs pushed back at odd angles and wine rings on the wood that no one had bothered to wipe up. The remains of a meal that had turned into a battlefield, the aftermath of a truth no one could put back in the box. Mark was already waiting in the den, his posture stiff, but not defiant, more like a man preparing himself for a conversation he knew he wasn't going to win. He wore the same sweater from the night before, but it hung looser now, as if the weight of the last 12 hours had sunk into his shoulders and stretched the fabric with shame. Margaret wasn't in the room, but I knew she was somewhere nearby, probably behind one of the closed hallway doors, listening as she always did, silently, carefully, the way only a woman trained in the art of quiet control knows how to. He didn't ask me to sit, and I didn't pretend to be polite. I stood in front of the fireplace, hands clasped, watching him, waiting for the words he thought might fix this, as if language had any power over something that had already been set in legal stone. And then, finally, in a tone that wasn't quite angry, wasn't quite apologetic, but edged with something bitter, Mark said, "You win." There it was. 2 words. Short, simple, and for the first time in my life, he meant them. Not as a surrender, not fully, but as an admission that the balance had finally shifted, that the rules had changed, and that I'd become the person he never imagined I was capable of becoming, the one holding the pen, the keys, and the deed. But I didn't flinch, didn't gloat, didn't rush to celebrate the victory he was trying to hand me, because winning, in a family like ours, never came with applause or a parade. It came with blood on the floor, silence in the hallway, and years of emotional debris no one could sweep up without bleeding. I wasn't there for closure. I was there to finish the story the way it was meant to end, on my terms, not theirs. I didn't do this to win, Mark, I said, finally breaking the stillness with a voice as calm and composed as I could manage, though even I could feel the tremble under the surface. I did it to survive. He looked away, his eyes flicking to the mantel where a dozen framed photos of our family used to stand. Now only 3 remained, all of them centered on him, his children, and Margaret. My absence from the images had always been subtle but consistent, like the casual editing of someone trying to rewrite history without admitting it aloud. "I built that company," he muttered, the defiance trying to claw its way back into his voice, though it sounded more like a ghost now than a truth. "From the ground up. You took something that didn't belong to you." And that's when I finally sat, not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to look him in the eye and make sure he heard every single word without the excuse of distraction. "You built it," I said slowly, "but you sold it. Piece by piece. When the numbers started slipping and the banks stopped returning your calls. When the partnerships crumbled and the contracts dried up. You took shortcuts. You took anonymous capital. You signed agreements without reading them. You leveraged your pride against reality until there was nothing left but paperwork and hope. And I was the only one who saw it for what it was, a fire dressed up as growth." He didn't argue. Not this time. "I could have let it burn," I added, my tone soft but resolute. "I could have stood back and watched you collapse, let the market tear you apart, let your ego devour your assets. But I didn't. I stepped in. I gave you money, structure, resources. I rebuilt it under your nose because I knew the only way you'd accept help was if you didn't know it was coming from me." He looked up then, finally, and there was something behind his eyes I hadn't seen since we were teenagers, that old flicker of respect he used to have for me before our mother taught him that my silence was worth less than his mistakes. "You should have told me," he whispered. "And you should have valued me," I said, not cruelly, not as a weapon, but as a fact. But here we are. I stood again, because there was nothing else to say, and reached into my coat pocket for one last envelope, thinner than the last, simpler, but somehow heavier. I handed it to him and waited while he opened it, his fingers moving slower now, more carefully, like he already suspected that whatever was inside would be the final cut. It was a transfer agreement, not of ownership, but of seats. A restructuring of the board. Because while I may have acquired the company, I never intended to keep it in its original form. I didn't want to wear his skin like a trophy. I wanted to use it to build something of my own, something clean, something accountable, something that didn't need his name on the door. "You'll still be involved," I said. "But not in charge. Not anymore." He read the terms. He didn't argue. He just nodded once, slowly, and that was enough. Behind me, a door creaked open and Margaret emerged, her face pale, her mouth set in that tight, practiced line that had silenced me for decades, but no longer held power. She stepped forward, her voice low and unsure for the first time in as long as I could remember, and said, "Why did you go so far?" I turned to her, and for the first time in my life, I saw her not as the architect of my pain, not as the villain in my origin story, but simply as a woman who had built her house on a lie and finally found herself standing in its ruins. "Because you erased me," I said. "And now I've erased your legacy." She opened her mouth to speak, but I walked past her before the words could land, because whatever she had to say now wouldn't matter, and I wasn't interested in apologies shaped like excuses. I stepped out into the cold, the morning still wet with dew, the sky heavy with the weight of change, and for the first time in years, I felt the kind of freedom that doesn't come from being given anything, but from taking back what was stolen, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. And as I reached the edge of the driveway, I turned back once, not to check if they were watching, but because I needed to see the house one last time, the place where I had been silenced, shaped, ignored, and eventually sharpened into someone they could no longer control. Sometimes, the only way to make peace with the past is to burn the blueprint and build something they'll never understand. And sometimes, you don't need to be loved, remembered, or forgiven. You just need to be done.